She gave a home to black children, but her true reason remained a secret. When the truth came out, the consequences were unpredictable. What was she hiding? Don't forget to subscribe and let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? The early morning sun cast a soft golden hue over the city, slowly breathing life into the bustling streets. Sarah Morgan sat by her apartment window, sipping her black coffee, the steam rising in delicate tendrils. This had become a familiar ritual, a rare moment of peace before the chaos of the day consumed her. But today, the peace felt heavier than usual. The weight of what she had witnessed 2 nights ago refused to leave her mind, gnawing at her every thought. It had been late, almost midnight, when Sarah decided to take a detour home after dinner with friends. As she crossed through a poorly lit street, she saw a group of police officers pinning a young black boy to the pavement. The boy couldn't have been older than 16, his face pressed against the asphalt, his eyes wide with fear as he pleaded for help. One officer's knee was crushing his neck, eerily reminiscent of scenes that had gripped the nation before. The others barked orders, ignoring the boy's sobbing apologies, his protests that he had done nothing wrong. Sarah stood frozen, her heart racing as her phone slipped from her fingers. She had read about such incidents countless times on the news, but witnessing it firsthand was something else entirely, raw and devastating. Her body moved before her mind could catch up. She pulled out her phone and started recording, shouting, "Stop! You're hurting him! He can't breathe!" The officers turned their cold, indifferent stares toward her, but she held her ground. Her voice wavered with anger and fear, but she refused to look away. One of the officers, a burly man with a shaved head, sneered, "Mind your own business, lady. This has nothing to do with you." But it did. In that moment, Sarah knew it did. The boy's terrified eyes locked onto hers, silent pleas, as if she was his last chance at mercy. "You can't do this," she shouted. "You'll kill him." Her voice cut through the air, startling the other officers just enough for them to shift their weight. The boy gasped, inhaling desperately as the knee was lifted, though the fear in his eyes remained. The officers eventually let him go, but not before issuing a string of threats. "Stay quiet about this," the lead officer warned, his voice low and dangerous. "If you know what's good for you." The boy stumbled to his feet, clutching his ribs, and sprinted down the alley without looking back. Sarah stood there, shaken to her core. She knew she couldn't unsee what had just unfolded in front of her. The officers had treated the boy not like a human being, but like a problem to be subdued, something disposable. That realization hit her harder than anything else. It felt like a fracture opening in her soul, something that could never be repaired. Back in her apartment now, Sarah scrolled through her phone, reading messages from friends. She hadn't told anyone what had happened, not yet. Fear gnawed at her. What if the police retaliated? What if no one believed her? But more than fear, it was the feeling of helplessness that consumed her. How could she live in a world where children were treated like criminals because of the color of their skin? How many more stories like his were unfolding in dark alleys and quiet streets, unseen and unrecorded? She knew that simply going back to her ordinary life wasn't an option anymore. Something had shifted inside her. But what could she do? What power did she have? Just one woman with no experience in activism or the justice system. The thought haunted her as the day wore on. She paced the apartment, trying to shake the images from her mind. But they followed her, lurking in the shadows of every quiet moment. By noon, she found herself searching online, reading articles, scrolling through forums about police brutality, systemic racism, and youth violence. She stumbled upon stories of other young black teens who had been brutalized or killed, their names etched into protests and memorials across the country. Each article felt like another punch to the gut. She could feel the anger rising inside her, coiling tightly like a spring. This wasn't just about one boy. This was about a system designed to oppress, and she couldn't stand by and watch it happen. As the hours passed, an idea began to take shape, something terrifying and exhilarating all at once. What if she did something? Not just a post on social media or a donation, but something tangible, something real. Her mind raced. She thought about the kids she had seen wandering the streets in the poor neighborhoods she passed every day, the ones who always looked lost, angry, and forgotten. Where did they go when the world turned its back on them? What safety nets existed for children targeted by a system rigged against them? The answer was obvious. There were none. Sarah sat down at her desk, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She typed out a list: needs, resources, ideas, a shelter, a place where kids could feel safe, where they would be treated with the dignity they deserved. Somewhere they could go if they were harassed or brutalized. It was a crazy idea. She knew that. She wasn't wealthy or well-connected. Running a shelter required funding, permits, staff, things she knew nothing about. And she could already hear the backlash from her family and friends. "You're not responsible for fixing the world, Sarah." But the idea had taken root, and deep down she knew it wasn't going away. The next few days were a blur. She visited community centers, spoke with local activists, and tried to understand what it would take to open a shelter. The response was mixed. Some people applauded her initiative. Others dismissed her, calling her naive and idealistic. "This isn't your fight," one activist told her bluntly. "White saviors don't solve systemic problems." The words stung, but Sarah refused to be discouraged. She wasn't trying to be a savior. She just wanted to help. Her determination grew stronger with every step. She made phone calls, set up meetings, and started drafting a proposal. If she was going to do this, she needed to do it right. But it wasn't long before she encountered her first major hurdle: the police. News of her plans had reached the precinct, and the officers she had confronted that night weren't happy. One afternoon, she found a note slipped under her apartment door. "Stay out of this or else." Her hands trembled as she read the message. Fear gripped her, but it didn't stop her. If anything, it made her more determined. These kids had nowhere to turn, and that was exactly why she had to move forward. One evening, as she sat surrounded by papers and notes, Sarah's phone buzzed. It was a text from a local activist she had met earlier that week. "Come to the community center tomorrow. There's someone you need to meet." The next morning, she arrived at the center and found a group of teenagers huddled around a table. They glanced up as she entered, their faces a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Among them was the boy she had seen that night, the one the officers had brutalized. His name was Malik. He recognized her instantly, his expression shifting from wary to grateful. "You're the lady from the alley," he said quietly. Sarah nodded. "Yeah, are you okay?" Malik shrugged. "Better than some." They talked for hours that day. Malik opened up about his experiences with the police, sharing stories that made Sarah's heart ache. He wasn't alone. Every teen at that table had a similar story, each one more heartbreaking than the last. And that was the moment Sarah knew. This wasn't just an idea anymore. It was a necessity. The shelter would happen, no matter what. The first steps toward creating the shelter were filled with uncertainty. Sarah had spent countless nights scouring websites, making phone calls, and reaching out to anyone who might help. Every step forward felt like a victory, but each small victory was accompanied by new challenges. She knew the most urgent need was finding a space, a building where she could provide safety for teenagers like Malik. The goal felt distant and overwhelming. Real estate was expensive, and most landlords turned her away the moment she mentioned sheltering at-risk youth. "That kind of trouble brings the wrong crowd," one landlord had said, his tone curt. "I'm not renting to someone who'll have the cops at my door every week." It was the same response everywhere she went. Nobody wanted to get involved. Frustration clawed at Sarah's insides, but she kept going, determined not to let this dream fall apart before it even began. Malik's face stayed with her, a constant reminder of why she couldn't give up. One evening, after another string of rejections, Sarah met with Malik and a few other teenagers she had befriended at the community center. They sat around a folding table in a cramped, dimly lit room. Some of the kids slouched in their chairs, their defenses still high, reluctant to trust anyone. "I've got bad news," Sarah admitted, her hands clasped together on the table. "It's been hard finding a place. People don't want to rent to us." Malik leaned back, arms crossed. "Figures. They never want to help people like us." The bitterness in his voice stung, but Sarah knew he was right. These kids had been failed by the system too many times. "I'm not giving up," she said softly. "I just need more time." One of the younger boys, Tyrone, looked at her with quiet skepticism. "You really think people like us can have a future?" Sarah hesitated. She wanted to give them an easy answer, but the truth was she didn't know. All she had was hope and the will to try. Before she could respond, Malik spoke up. "She's trying, Tyrone. That's more than most people ever do." It was a small moment, but it filled Sarah with resolve. These kids needed someone to believe in them, and she would be that person no matter how difficult the road ahead. The breakthrough came a week later. A woman named Angela, a local business owner who ran a coffee shop, offered to rent an unused part of her building to Sarah at a reduced rate. The space wasn't perfect. It was old, dusty, and needed serious repairs, but it was something. When Sarah toured the building for the first time, Malik came with her. He stood in the center of the dusty room, hands shoved into his pockets, as Sarah tried to imagine what the place could become. "It's not much," she admitted, brushing cobwebs from a window, "but it's a start." Malik gave a small, approving nod. "It'll work." The next few weeks were a blur of activity. Sarah spent her savings on supplies, paint, cleaning products, furniture, and enlisted the help of anyone willing to pitch in. Angela provided coffee and sandwiches for the volunteers, and word about the project began to spread. Some members of the community embraced the idea, donating old furniture or offering their time. Others weren't as supportive. A few neighbors complained about bringing trouble into the neighborhood, and the whispers of disapproval followed Sarah everywhere she went. Then came the visits from the police. It started with subtle warnings, officers stopping by under the pretense of routine checks. They loitered outside the building, watching as the kids worked with Sarah to clean and renovate the space. The air felt thick with silent accusations, as if they were waiting for something to go wrong. One day, Officer Randall, a familiar face Sarah wished she could forget, walked into the building uninvited. He was the same officer who had pinned Malik to the pavement that night in the alley, and the sight of him made her stomach twist. "Well, well," Randall said, looking around the half-finished space with a smug grin. "So, this is your little project." Sarah crossed her arms, keeping her voice steady. "Is there a problem, officer?" Randall's grin widened. "No problem. Just checking in, making sure everything's legal." His words dripped with condescension, and Sarah felt her hands curl into fists at her sides. Malik stood behind her, his body rigid, every muscle in his frame screaming tension. "You're not welcome here," Sarah said firmly. Randall chuckled. "Relax, just doing my job. Wouldn't want anything to happen to your little operation now, would we?" The threat was thinly veiled, but Sarah refused to be intimidated. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "We have every right to be here. You can tell whoever sent you that we're not going anywhere." Randall's smile faded, and for a moment, something dangerous flickered in his eyes. But he said nothing more. With a shrug, he turned and walked out, leaving the door swinging behind him. Malik exhaled sharply. "That guy's going to be a problem." Sarah nodded. "Let him try." But as soon as Randall left, doubt crept into Sarah's mind. She knew this was only the beginning. The police wouldn't back off easily, and resistance from the community was bound to grow. Every step forward felt like a step deeper into enemy territory. The next day, Sarah met with a group of parents at the community center to explain her vision for the shelter. Some were supportive, but others voiced their concerns loudly. "What are you going to do when those kids start causing trouble?" one woman demanded. "My son doesn't need to be around criminals." "They're not criminals," Sarah said, struggling to keep her temper in check. "They're kids, and they deserve a chance just like anyone else." But it was clear not everyone shared her belief. Prejudices ran deep, and fear of the unknown made people cling to their assumptions. Sarah left the meeting feeling drained, but not defeated. When she returned to the building that night, she found Malik and the other kids still hard at work, painting walls and sweeping floors. They had transformed the space into something hopeful, a place that felt alive, full of possibility. Malik glanced at her as she entered, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Told you it'd work." Sarah smiled back, her heart swelling with pride. They had come this far, and she knew they could go even further. But as she looked around the room, surrounded by kids who had already faced more hardship than most adults, Sarah realized the hardest part was yet to come. They were building more than just a shelter. They were building a future, and the world wasn't ready for them. The shelter had barely opened its doors when the pressure began to build. Sarah had expected some resistance, but the intensity of the backlash caught her off guard. Almost overnight, the community's whispers turned into open hostility. Flyers were posted around the neighborhood warning residents about delinquents moving in. People stopped donating, and volunteers pulled out, citing concerns for their safety. Then came the more dangerous acts, bricks thrown through windows at night, the spray-painted slurs across the walls. Each morning, Sarah and the kids painted over the graffiti and swept up broken glass, their silent resilience growing stronger with every attack. Malik was often the first one out, ready with a broom or a paintbrush in hand. "I've seen worse," he would mutter when Sarah asked how he was holding up. But the weight in his eyes told her otherwise. The police, of course, were no help. Randall and his colleagues seemed to delight in their misfortune, patrolling by slowly in their cruisers, making it clear that they weren't there to protect. When Sarah tried reporting the vandalism, Randall showed up at her door, his smirk as infuriating as ever. "You should have known better than to stir up trouble," he said, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Kids like these, they bring problems with them." Sarah clenched her jaw, fighting the urge to slam the door in his face. "These kids deserve a chance," she said firmly, "and I'll be damned if I let anyone take that away from them." Randall's smile didn't waver. "We'll see how long you last." As weeks passed, the tension escalated. A small but vocal group of residents started attending town hall meetings, demanding that the shelter be shut down. They brought stories, exaggerated, twisted accounts of kids from the shelter causing trouble in the neighborhood. Sarah knew the accusations were false, but fighting them was like trying to hold back a flood. One evening, Sarah attended one of those meetings, determined to defend the shelter. She stood at the front of a packed room, facing dozens of angry faces. Randall was there, sitting in the back with a smug look on his face, as if waiting for her to fail. "The kids we're helping have nowhere else to go," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the nerves twisting in her stomach. "This shelter isn't just a building. It's a lifeline, and we're doing everything we can to ensure they succeed." A man near the front scoffed. "And what happens when one of them robs a store? Or worse, are you going to take responsibility then?" Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat. "These are children. They've been through things most of us can't even imagine. They don't need punishment. They need understanding." "You're endangering our community," another woman snapped. "You're inviting trouble." Sarah's knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of the podium. "What I'm inviting," she said carefully, "is hope. And if that's a threat to you, maybe you should ask yourself why." The room fell into uneasy silence, the hostility momentarily dampened. But Sarah knew it wouldn't last. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave, Randall brushed past her, close enough to whisper in her ear, "You're playing with fire." Sarah ignored him, walking out with her head held high. But as soon as she reached the parking lot, the weight of it all crashed down on her. She leaned against her car, taking deep, shaky breaths to keep herself from falling apart. Malik was waiting for her when she returned to the shelter that night. He sat on the front steps, his shoulders hunched, the weight of the world pressing down on him, too. "They won't stop, will they?" he asked quietly, not looking at her. Sarah sat beside him, the cool night air brushing against their skin. "No," she admitted, "but neither will we." Malik gave a small, bitter laugh. "You make it sound so easy." "It's not," Sarah whispered, "but we don't have a choice." The days that followed were grueling. With the town turning against them, Sarah struggled to keep the shelter afloat. Donations dried up, and more than once she found herself staring at the nearly empty pantry, wondering how she would feed everyone. Malik noticed the worry etched on her face, but he never said a word about it. Instead, he did what he could to help, fixing things around the shelter, offering quiet encouragement to the younger kids. But the pressure began to take a toll on the teenagers. One night, a fight broke out between Malik and another boy, Tyrone, over something trivial, a stolen pair of sneakers. Sarah found them in the hallway, fists flying, as the other kids shouted and egged them on. "Enough!" Sarah's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and unyielding. She stepped between the boys, pushing them apart. Tyrone stormed off, his face twisted with anger. But Malik stayed, panting, fists still clenched at his sides. "He was asking for it," Malik muttered, avoiding Sarah's gaze. Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch both firm and gentle. "I know you're angry," she said softly, "but you can't fight your way through this." Malik shrugged off her hand. "What do you expect me to do, huh? Just sit here and take it?" "No," Sarah said, her heart aching for him. "But you have to be smarter than them. Fighting won't change anything. It'll only give them what they want. Malek's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him. He knew she was right, but the frustration inside him had nowhere to go. Sarah wished she could take that pain away, but all she could do was stand beside him, offering what little comfort she had. The next day, things took a darker turn. As Sarah and the kids returned from a trip to the community center, they found the shelter vandalized. The windows were shattered, furniture overturned, and hateful messages scrawled across the walls. It was a deliberate, calculated attack, a warning that things would only get worse. Malek stood in the middle of the destruction, his jaw clenched, fists trembling at his sides. "They want us gone," he whispered, his voice filled with rage and despair. Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder, grounding him. "We're not going anywhere," she said firmly. "We rebuild." The kids worked through the night, cleaning up the mess and patching what they could. They were exhausted, but their determination burned brighter than ever. Sarah watched them with a mixture of pride and sorrow, knowing that no child should have to bear such burdens. When morning came, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, the weight of the world pressing down on her. The shelter was holding together by a thread, and she knew they couldn't survive another attack like this. But as she looked around at the faces of the kids she had come to love, she knew she couldn't give up. Not now, not ever. They had already lost so much. She wouldn't let them lose this too. The shelter was barely back in order when the unthinkable happened. One humid afternoon, as the kids played soccer in the lot outside, 2 police cruisers pulled up. The children froze as officers stepped out, hands on their belts, scanning the scene with cold, scrutinizing eyes. Malek, who had been kicking the ball around with some of the younger boys, tensed immediately. He recognized Randall's swagger as the officer approached. "Malek Woods," Randall called, his voice sharp with mock authority. Malek's jaw tightened, but he stayed where he was. Sarah stepped between them, her heart pounding in her chest. "Officer Randall, what is this about?" she asked, her voice steady, though every muscle in her body screamed with tension. Randall gave her a patronizing smile. "Just routine business, ma'am. We received a report about a theft in the neighborhood." He motioned toward Malek. "Seems our young friend here fits the description." The children around Malek began to shrink back, their eyes wide with fear. Malek stood still, his fists clenched at his sides, his breathing shallow. Sarah crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "He's been here all day, with me and the rest of the kids. Whatever theft you're talking about, it has nothing to do with him." Randall tilted his head, his smile unwavering. "Is that so? Then he won't mind coming down to the station for a little chat, will he?" "Absolutely not." Sarah's voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. "Unless you have a warrant or evidence, Malek isn't going anywhere." Randall's smile faltered. His eyes darkened with irritation and his hand drifted to the cuffs on his belt. "Interfering with police business is a crime, you know," he warned, taking a step closer. Sarah's heart raced, but she didn't move. "You can intimidate me, Randall. I know the law." The tension was palpable, thick enough to suffocate everyone watching. Malek clenched his fist tighter, struggling to contain his anger. Sarah knew if she didn't defuse the situation quickly, things could spiral out of control. Before Randall could make another move, another officer, a younger man with an uneasy expression, stepped forward. "Maybe we should let this one go, Randall," he murmured. "We've got nothing solid." Randall shot the younger officer a venomous glare but reluctantly backed off. "For now," he sneered, "but don't think this is over." He turned to leave, and as the cruisers pulled away, The tension in the air remained, thick and stifling. Malik exhaled, his hands still trembling with rage. "They're never going to leave us alone," he muttered bitterly. Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. "I know," she said softly, "but we won't let them win." That night, the shelter was quiet, the weight of what had happened pressing down on everyone. Malik sat alone in the common room, his mind racing. The injustice of it all gnawed at him. How easily Randall had tried to take him, how powerless he had felt. Sarah found him sitting there, staring blankly at the wall. She sat beside him, not saying anything at first. "It's not fair," Malik whispered finally, his voice cracking with frustration. "They don't even care if we're innocent. All they see is this." He gestured toward his dark skin, his face twisted with a mix of anger and pain. Sarah's heart broke for him. She wanted to promise that things would get better, that the world wasn't always this cruel, but she couldn't lie to him. "You're right," she said softly. "It isn't fair, and I wish I could change that overnight. But what I can promise is that you won't face it alone, not while I'm here." Malik wiped at his eyes, embarrassed by the tears threatening to spill over. Sarah gave him a small, reassuring smile. "They want us to give up," she continued. "That's how they win. But we're stronger than that." Malik nodded slowly, though the anger in his chest didn't ease. The next few days were tense. Randall's visit had left everyone on edge, and Sarah knew the kids were waiting for the next confrontation, dreading what might come next. But life had to go on. They still had chores to do, meals to prepare, and schoolwork to complete. One evening, as Sarah sat at the dining table sorting through donations, Malik approached her. "I've been thinking," he said, shifting nervously from foot to foot. "What if we started documenting everything? The harassment, the threats, everything." Sarah looked up, intrigued. "You mean, like keeping a record?" Malik nodded. "Yeah, we can't stop them from coming after us, but maybe if we have proof, we can make someone listen." It was a brilliant idea, one that Sarah wished she had thought of sooner. She smiled at Malik, feeling a spark of hope for the first time in days. "You're right," she said. "We'll do it. Every time they come by, every threat, every act of vandalism, we document it all." They spent the next few days gathering supplies, cameras, notebooks, anything they could use to record their interactions with the police and hostile neighbors. Malik took charge of teaching the younger kids how to use the equipment, showing them how to quietly capture footage on their phones. The sense of purpose lifted the kids' spirits. They felt empowered, no longer just victims waiting for the next blow to fall. It didn't take long for Randall to return. This time, he wasn't alone. He brought 2 more officers with him. They demanded to search the shelter, claiming they had received reports of stolen property being hidden there. But Sarah and the kids were ready. As the officers entered, Malik discreetly hit record on the phone in his pocket. The younger kids scattered, each with a camera or phone in hand, documenting everything. Sarah stood her ground as Randall sneered at her. "Got something to hide?" he taunted. "Not at all," Sarah replied smoothly. "But I hope you know you're being recorded. Everything you say and do will be documented." Randall's smirk faltered for a moment, and Sarah felt a surge of triumph. "Smile," Malik whispered from behind his camera. "You're on record." The officers searched the shelter but found nothing. When they left, their frustration was evident, and Sarah knew they would be back. But for now, they had won a small victory. The kids cheered as soon as the police were out of sight. their laughter filling the air for the first time in what felt like forever. Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with pride. They were learning to fight back, not with violence, but with strategy and resilience, and it was only the beginning. The tension in the neighborhood grew after the police's unsuccessful search. It was clear to Sarah that Randall and the authorities wouldn't let things rest. Their resentment for being recorded was now mixed with a desire for revenge. The kids sensed the change too, but Sarah encouraged them to stay focused on school and daily routines. Still, she could feel their unease. Each new day brought an air of uncertainty, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. Sarah continued documenting every encounter with the police, and her collection of evidence grew rapidly. Malik was diligent in keeping everything organized. Timestamps, videos, incident reports, every encounter was carefully filed. Sarah hoped that with enough proof, she could involve a lawyer or advocate to challenge the harassment legally. But the path ahead was anything but easy. The neighbors began to show their true colors, too. Sarah caught snippets of conversation as she walked through the streets, snide remarks about those kids, and backhanded comments about her being too soft-hearted. When she ran into the same woman from the grocery store, the conversation was anything but pleasant. "You're stirring up trouble, you know that?" the woman said, folding her arms across her chest. "Keeping those kids here is just asking for more visits from the police. If you ask me, they don't belong here. They belong exactly where they are," Sarah replied sharply, her patience wearing thin. "And as long as I have a say, they're staying." The woman scoffed. "You can't protect them forever. People like them always find their way back to trouble." Sarah's blood boiled, but she bit back her anger. She knew people like this woman, people who saw the kids not as individuals but as stereotypes, assuming that their futures were already written. But Sarah had no intention of letting anyone dictate the fates of her children. One evening, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, poring over her growing file of evidence. The weight of it all pressed on her shoulders. She was fighting a battle against a system designed to keep people like Malik and the others down. And yet, for every victory, like scaring off Randall with the cameras, there seemed to be 10 new obstacles. Sarah knew she needed help. The harassment was escalating, and the neighbors were becoming bolder. She could feel the walls closing in. That's when Malik came to her with an idea. "We need someone on the inside," he said, "a lawyer or an activist, someone with connections who knows how to fight this stuff." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. It was a good plan, but finding someone willing to stand up against police harassment and systemic racism wasn't going to be easy. The fear of retribution kept many people silent. Still, she had to try. The next day, Sarah spent hours on the phone, reaching out to legal aid organizations and civil rights groups. Most were sympathetic but non-committal, unwilling to take on the police department without airtight evidence. Just as she was beginning to feel discouraged, she got a call back from someone who gave her a glimmer of hope. Her name was Andrea Holt, a seasoned civil rights attorney with a reputation for taking on tough cases. When they met in a small cafe on the edge of town, Andrea's presence immediately put Sarah at ease. She had the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she'd seen it all and wasn't afraid of any of it. "I've read through your file," Andrea said, tapping the stack of documents Sarah had sent her. "You've got enough here to raise some serious questions, but it won't be easy. Police harassment cases are hard to prove, and the department will fight back. Hard." "I understand," Sarah said, her voice steady, "but I won't back down. These kids deserve better." Andrea studied her for a moment, then gave a curt nod. All right, let's make some noise. The fight officially began with a letter from Andrea's office, a formal complaint against Randall and his team, citing harassment and misconduct. The letter was carefully worded, demanding an investigation and hinting at further legal action if the harassment didn't stop. Sarah knew it was a small step, but it felt monumental. For the first time, they were fighting back with more than just cameras. News of the complaint spread quickly. Randall, furious that his actions were being scrutinized, ramped up his intimidation tactics. Police cruisers started parking outside the shelter at odd hours, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows across the windows. Officers loitered nearby, watching the kids whenever they ventured outside. The children were terrified. Malik tried to stay brave for the younger ones, but Sarah could see the fear lurking beneath his defiant exterior. The weight of protecting them all felt heavier than ever. But now, with Andrea on their side, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. One day, Randall came by again, this time with a smug grin that made Sarah's stomach churn. "Got yourself a lawyer, huh?" he sneered, leaning against the fence. "Think that's gonna save you?" Sarah stepped forward, her voice calm but unwavering. "No, Randall, but it's a start." The harassment didn't stop, but things began to shift in unexpected ways. Andrea's involvement drew the attention of local media, and reporters started asking questions. A small but determined group of activists rallied behind the shelter, organizing community meetings and fundraisers. The tide was slowly turning, and Sarah could feel the momentum building. The shelter became more than just a refuge for the kids. It became a symbol of resistance. People who had once turned a blind eye to the injustices in their community were now standing with Sarah, demanding accountability from the police and the city government. But the struggle was far from over. Randall and his officers weren't the only ones trying to undermine Sarah's efforts. The city council began scrutinizing the shelter, looking for any excuse to shut it down. Inspections became frequent, and bureaucratic hurdles seemed to appear overnight. Sarah met each challenge head-on, refusing to be intimidated. She leaned on Andrea and the activists, finding strength in their support. Together, they filed petitions, attended council meetings, and pushed back against every attempt to close the shelter. One night, as Sarah sat on the porch with Malik, watching the stars, he spoke quietly. "I didn't think people would care. I thought we were on our own." Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "We're not alone, Malik, and we never were. It just takes time for people to wake up." Malik nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Do you think they'll ever stop? The police, I mean." "I don't know," Sarah admitted, "but as long as we stand together, they won't win." For the first time in weeks, Malik smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. It was a small victory, but for Sarah, it meant everything. The next morning, Sarah woke to find a letter slipped under the shelter's door. It was from the city council informing her that the shelter would be officially reviewed at the next council meeting. The review would determine whether the shelter would be allowed to stay open or be forced to close. Sarah knew the meeting would be a turning point. Either they would win and secure the shelter's future, or they would lose and be forced to start over from scratch. She gathered the kids in the common room, explaining the situation as calmly as she could. "We've come this far," she said, her voice steady. "We're not giving up now." The kids nodded, their faces solemn but determined. They knew what was at stake. Malik stood up, his voice firm. "We'll be there, Miss Sarah, all of us. This is our home, and we're going to fight for it." Sarah felt a surge of pride and gratitude. No matter what happened at that council meeting, they had already won in the ways that mattered most. They were a family worth fighting for. The day of the council meeting arrived, and the atmosphere in the shelter was charged with a mixture of fear and determination. Sarah gathered the children early, ensuring they were dressed neatly and prepared for the long day ahead. She knew the meeting would be their most critical battle yet, one that could decide the future of their home. As the kids filed out of the shelter, Malik stood by Sarah's side, his expression serious. "Do you think they'll listen?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll make them listen," Sarah replied, her voice firm. "No one can ignore us anymore." Together, they walked toward City Hall, joined by Andrea, the civil rights attorney, and a small group of supporters who had rallied around the shelter. Among them were teachers, activists, and concerned neighbors who had grown to care about the children's well-being. Inside the City Hall, the tension was palpable. Randall stood near the back, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on Sarah. The smug grin on his face told her he was confident that the council would side with him. But Sarah refused to let his presence shake her. She focused on the task ahead, speaking the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might make the council members. The meeting began with formalities. Council members droned through their agenda, their voices indifferent and rehearsed. Finally, the topic of the shelter was brought to the floor. Sarah felt her heart pound as the mayor, a man who had shown little interest in their cause, called her forward. She took a deep breath and stepped to the podium. Malik and the other children sat in the audience, their eyes fixed on her, silent but present. She knew they were counting on her to speak for them. "Good afternoon, members of the council," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "I stand before you today, not as a charity worker or an activist, but as a mother. These children, every one of them, are my family. They've been abandoned by a system that was supposed to protect them, but they've found a home with me, and I won't let that be taken away." She paused, scanning the room. Some council members looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. Randall smirked from the back of the room, but Sarah ignored him. "This shelter isn't just a building," she continued. "It's a chance, perhaps the only chance these kids have to escape a future shaped by neglect, discrimination, and violence. We've faced harassment, intimidation, and more roadblocks than I can count. But we're still here, and we won't stop fighting." Andrea stood beside her, ready to provide legal arguments if needed. But this moment wasn't about law. It was about humanity. Sarah knew she had to reach the hearts of these people, not just their sense of duty. "I understand the concerns some of you might have," she said. "I know that change is hard and fear is easy. But I ask you, what kind of city do we want to be? One that turns its back on children in need, or one that stands up for them no matter how difficult it might be?" The room fell silent as Sarah's words hung in the air. For a moment, it seemed as though her speech had hit a nerve. Then Randall stood abruptly, his voice cutting through the quiet. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he said, his tone dripping with contempt. "These kids, you think they're innocent? You think you can save them? They're trouble, every last one of them, and you're wasting your time." Sarah's hands tightened on the podium, but she refused to be drawn into his trap. "These kids are not criminals," she said calmly. "They are survivors. And if you can't see that, the problem isn't with them, it's with you." Randall's face twisted in anger, but before he could respond, Andrea stepped forward. "That's enough," she said sharply. "We've provided evidence of harassment, misconduct, and discrimination. The only thing left is for this council to decide, do you stand with those who need help or with those who abuse their power? The mayor called for a recess, and Sarah returned to her seat, her heart pounding. Malik reached over and squeezed her hand. "You did great, Miss Sarah," he whispered. Sarah gave him a small smile, but the weight of the moment pressed heavily on her. The outcome was out of her hands now, resting in the decisions of people who had the power to shape their future. The break felt like an eternity, but eventually the council members returned to their seats. The mayor cleared his throat, glancing around the room. After reviewing the evidence and hearing both sides, he began, the council has decided to allow the shelter to remain open. A wave of relief washed over Sarah, and the children erupted into cheers. Malik hugged her tightly, and tears welled in her eyes as the reality of their victory sank in. They had won. Against all odds, they had won. Randall stormed out of the room, his face a mask of fury. But Sarah didn't care. For the first time in months, she felt hope, a hope that burned brighter than the fear that had once consumed her. As they left City Hall, the group of supporters surrounded them, offering congratulations and words of encouragement. Reporters snapped photos, and activists handed out flyers promoting their next steps. The shelter had not only survived, it had become a beacon of change. Andrea smiled as she walked beside Sarah. "You did it," she said. "We did it," Sarah corrected, her voice filled with gratitude. "And this is just the beginning." That evening, the shelter was filled with laughter and joy. The children played without fear for the first time in months, their spirits lifted by the knowledge that their home was safe. Sarah watched them from the porch, her heart full. Malik joined her, sitting quietly for a moment before speaking. "Do you think things will get better now?" he asked. Sarah smiled, her gaze never leaving the children. "I don't know, Malik," she admitted, "but I know we'll face whatever comes next together." And with that, the fear that had loomed over them began to fade. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like a future worth fighting for. The fight was far from over, but tonight they celebrated, not just their victory, but the strength they had found in each other. No matter what challenges lay ahead, Sarah knew they would face them as a family forged in love, resilience, and hope. And that, she realized, was a victory no one could take from them. We hope you enjoyed this story. If you want to see more videos like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your subscriptions and likes inspire us to create even more content. Also, check out our other videos. Just click on the video on your screen and continue your journey with us. Thank you for being with us.